My own empirical studies have mostly confirmed this, right? That for governments to get involved, it's sort of do less and don't be directive, right? Like don't try to over-engineer. And I think today you're seeing a huge amount of over-engineering.
Welcome to the New Enlightenment podcast from Adam Smith's Panmure House. I'm Adam Dixon. Today I'm joined by Robyn Klingler-Vidra, who is reader in entrepreneurship and sustainability at King's Business School in London. She is the author of The Venture Capital State and Inclusive Innovation. Her most recent book, published in 2025, which we will discuss today, is Startup Capitalism: New Approaches to Innovation Strategies in East Asia. Robyn, welcome to the New Enlightenment.
Hi, Adam. Thanks very much for having me on.
So let's talk about venture capital, innovation, and what the state, what governments can do to support innovation ecosystems, to support venture capitalists and other financial institutions in driving innovation. Because I know these days governments around the world want to get in the act. They're anxious about supporting their industries. They're anxious about what artificial intelligence and new technologies mean for their economies, and they want to get out in front. And so they feel they need to support innovation. They need to support venture capitalists, often by becoming venture capitalists themselves. Give us a lay of the land. Where are we?
Great. Well, first to say, we're happy to talk about startup capitalism today, but maybe just as a way into that. So where I started with this research was on that venture capital piece, and venture capital as the sort of mechanism for boosting startup fueled innovation, right? Not sort of only innovation with large firms. And starting focused on venture capital, which I call the venture capital state, right? Governments have been using sort of three levers. One, regulation, right? Creating the right regulatory structure or legal structure, like the limited partnership structure, so that funds can operate in a way that minimizes risk. Tax incentives. Actually, in the UK, we have a pretty effective one, the Seed Enterprise Investment Scheme, SEIS, right? To make venture a more attractive asset class for angel investors and for private investors more generally. And then the government, as you say, as a VC themselves, the government investing as a fund of fund, or with, say, the British Business Bank. The most effective or famous version of the funding of venture capital, which created a whole cohort, was in Israel in the early 90s with the Yozma Fund that literally went from having one or two VCs in Israel in the early 90s. The Ministry of, or the Minister of Science created the Yozma Fund with the explicit aim of creating a VC market. So funded a cohort of about 10 private VCs who went on to have great success, invested in companies and then went public on NASDAQ and things. And that created this thriving cohort by the end of the 90s. So on venture capital, there's been sort of the primary levers of funding, tax, and regulation. But I would say that's expanded now, as you say it, to this promotion of startups more broadly, right? And this sort of startup zeitgeist, and what can governments do to fuel this startup-led mode of innovation? And there you see this much wider range of policies. So, for example, governments running accelerators, incubators, attracting talent and investment. So you have like Startup Chile, that's run by the Ministry of Economic Development in Chile, that brings entrepreneurs from around the world to start up in Santiago. You also have governments using sort of procurement mechanisms to be able to buy from startups to act as key customers themselves. So from a reasonably focused menu of policies, let's say in the venture capital domain, thinking about startups as this particular channel organizational form to fuel innovation, there's a much wider range. And actually my favorite one, just to say, that I wrote about in the conversation in January is the Japanese government in the early 2000s created or helped to support a show called Money Tigers, which is the basis for Shark Tank and Dragon's Den. And it was aimed at supporting a culture, bringing sort of entrepreneurship and trying to raise money from equity investors into the living room, into the everyday conversations to try to normalize it. So there's a range of mechanisms that governments have used. Maybe just quickly to say, I mean, also on the why of venture capital or why of startups. I mean, on the venture capital, there's been a fair consensus. There's never a full consensus in academic research, but a fair consensus to show that there's a relationship between venture capital and innovation, right? And different studies in the finance literature that show that the VC-backed startups adorn the most valuable companies, the companies that have had the most successful IPOs, et cetera. I've done a study with a friend of mine at the LSE with Juanita Gonzalez-Uribe, where we look at how VCs provide value outside of their portfolio companies, which is effectively just by having a startup go through due diligence and having a in-depth conversation with an investor, a VC that might invest in them. We see two outcomes, like two directions of outcomes that are really important in my view. One, you see an uptick in return on assets, their ability to fundraise, and employee growth, even if they don't end up raising money from that investor. But then crucially, and something that I hope we can talk about more in the conversation, which is a bit more critical or a bit more edgy, we also see a lever driving more business closures, right? And I think one of the sort of the problems of the way that startups have been increasingly supported is this idea of we just need more startups. We need more entrepreneurship, more activity is good. But we've also seen declining business dynamism, right? So is it the best use of resources?
Right. Because I had a conversation the other day with David Teese, one of the highest cited
capabilities.
Dynamic capabilities. And David and I were talking, and he was mentioning how, look at what's happening to companies like Intel and these big American corporations. And he attributes that to the leveraged buyout, the kind of private equity stripping assets, stock compensation for CEOs, and the way they did that was by cutting R&D, and that has prevented large companies, American companies, but also as has happened elsewhere in the world, from innovating, leaving innovation to the smaller startups, leaving it to the venture capital world, because it's not driven by, let's say, the finance of Wall Street or the City of London. David quipped that, well, Wall Street's not about attracting capital, it's about extracting capital. But I do have a question based on that, is that what you've just sketched out in terms of innovation, startups, is that not just simply a story of the last 2 decades, or let's say 25 years? And if we go back to say 50 years or 60 years, it's a very different story. And now we're moving into a world where, the IPO market, I think, is taking off slightly again, but, startups are staying private longer. They're staying, what is a venture capital firm now that they're so huge? I mean, Andreessen Horowitz is ginormous, right? These are these big companies. It's not that nimble startup. Where is the scale, if you like? And could you periodize this innovation landscape of VC? Because again, everyone thinks of Dragon's Den. They think of entrepreneurship. They think of small businesses. But is that really going to make, as you just mentioned, there's not that much business dynamism. More startups doesn't mean more dynamism, more innovation.
So a few things on the timing. So Henry Chesbrough and the idea of open innovation, I like a lot, right? And its rise, that you see the decline of internal R&D and those tight borders around companies and how they maintain their edge, how they innovate by the end of the 20th century. So I agree with you that it's certainly this zeitgeist or this expectation that startups fuel innovation is a 21st century phenomenon. The issue of business dynamism and its decline. I mean, this is, Ryan Decker, John Helty-Wanger, and economists who are looking at this, especially in the US. What I find fascinating is that this sort of social expectation and the almost uncritical acceptance that, of course, startups are innovative. They're disruptors. It's David versus Goliath. Startups have this natural role. Big businesses are sort of lumbering and pedestrian. And as you say, Andreessen Horowitz and venture capitalists are increasingly household names, right? That's a new thing. When I started researching venture capital and I started teaching entrepreneurial finance, I would ask for a sort of show of hands of who would know Sequoia, Index, etc., Kleiner Perkins, and there was almost none. And now they've gotten so big; they're multi-billion-dollar funds, as you say. The idea of venture capital has become so normalized and accepted. I think with that, there's concept stretching. Like, not everyone is doing venture capital. Not everyone is doing it well. I mean, it should be that it's smart money, right? That's why venture capital it should be sort of pursued. And just to say that before academia, I spent almost 10 years in the hedge fund industry, and I when I started doing my PhD focused on venture capital, I would sort of laugh that, venture capital had this incredibly positive connotation, right? Venture capital, according to Chris Mims in a, I think, 2010 Wall Street Journal editorial, had said that, venture capital is humanity's last great hope because it's going to fuel the future of innovation. And I was sort of reflecting on that and thinking, well, no one's ever said that about hedge funds, right? And, nowadays, one, VCs have gotten so big, and we all sort of take, in many ways, for granted that startups drive innovation and VCs are smart money. The good, and I think you see this in the data from Preqin and other industry reports, that there's a real pulling away. The top quartile of venture is fantastic, and they're very good at what they do. But now there's, and like we saw actually in hedge funds, right? When there's more that pile into the asset class, it gets more competitive, harder to make money. And I think there's a lot of investors that are sort of VCs now that aren't necessarily that high-powered smart money.
Let's go back to talking about government policy to support venture and innovative startups. Laid out the traditional mechanisms of tax incentives, other things that they can do to support it, and even cultural phenomena through Dragon's Den or Shark Tank. But increasingly we see, and I've written a lot about this, on state capital, the state wanting to be an active participant, an active entrepreneur. And, there's that idea has been popularized by the likes of Mariana Mazzucato with the entrepreneurial state. And this has given governments and policymakers this idea that they can also be venture capitalists. What's your view on that? And where is that going to go too far?
I think there's a question of to what end, right? What's the purpose? What's the aim? And I would say sort of in two parts. So Josh Lerner has done so much great work on government policy around venture capital, in many ways is the sort of motivation for my own work on that. And I've always, and my own empirical studies have mostly confirmed this, right? That for governments to get involved, it's sort of do less and don't be directive. Don't try to over-engineer. And I think today you're seeing a huge amount of over-engineering for various let's say, causes and the sort of distributional aims from the beginning. So I think that's one. In my own work, and you mentioned earlier my new book, Startup Capitalism, one of the things that we look at, and maybe just to answer by sort of describing the project, is, my co-author, Ramon Pacheco-Pardo, he and I were interested in, there's this ubiquity to governments supporting startups, right? We see this all over the world, right? You have the sort of Station F in Paris, you have Silicon monikers all over, you have Silicon Island, Silicon Beach, Silicon Roundabout here in London. But why are they doing it? How are they doing it? What are their aims? What are their, sort of KPIs? And one of the themes that came out, which was surprising to us as we were doing the sort of documenting of the policy aims and then interviews with government officials, is that the point of supporting startups wasn't necessarily to benefit startups so that the startups are going to be those sort of Schumpeterian entrepreneurs, that the startups are going to really disrupt, right? That drive the creative destruction. That it's at least also, or sometimes only, or primarily, that startups are this sort of resource for big business, for incumbent firms, which we found fascinating. So it's like, well, the why of supporting startups. If you take Schumpeter seriously, and I do. And so if I think about Schumpeter, there's like young Schumpeter and old Schumpeter, right? Like in his early years, Schumpeter says new entrants, which we now call startups, new entrants are driving innovation because they pose this existential threat to incumbent firms, and that makes incumbent firms hustle and innovate. Or the new entrants actually just disrupt and end, cut short the current technology's sort of life cycle. Older, later Schumpeter, those sort of Mark II, says that, well, and watching US Steel and watching AT&T, observes that these really well-capitalized big firms are making those transformational bets. And sort of different from the open innovation of Chesborough, right? It's like, as you had said earlier, it's the R&D budgets and it's having the world's best talent in your big firm. So like later Schumpeter says, it's that oligopolistic competition that's driving capitalism or humanity forward. And one of the things that I have found really interesting is that governments often today are trying implicitly, sometimes explicitly, to do both at the same time, right? They want startups who are, we're going to create a cohort of unicorns, right? We're going to create 20 unicorns. We're going to encourage, people to accelerate, to disrupt, to challenge. And also it is going to benefit, it's going to inject innovative DNA into big business. Maybe you can do both, but perhaps that declining business dynamism that we're observing in the 21st century is coming from the fact that we're trying to be both Schumpeters at the same time.
There's a bit of that protectionism of the incumbent, in a way. And that's, I guess, as a follow-up, my concern with governments becoming capitalists, or at least trying to, is it's very hard to be a capitalist in that you have to take the risk of failure seriously. And governments and civil servants and politicians don't like failure. A fundamental characteristic of venture capital is that for every one company that makes you rich, you've got 10, 20, 100 companies that you've invested in that have all gone bankrupt and cost you a lot of money. You say that to a policymaker who's just invested or, earmarked money for this new innovation support fund in wherever region or country you're in, and you say, well, actually, we're going to invest in 10 companies, 10 startups, and 9 of them are going to go bankrupt, and actually all 10 of them are going to go bankrupt. That's not something you can say to a government official, a politician. If you said that in San Francisco, Palo Alto, they'd say, okay, yeah, that's normal.
And in fact, sort of some of these training programs, let's say, of VCs in Silicon Valley will emphasize that you don't waste time on the portfolio companies that are struggling. You focus on the ones that have that winning sort of J curve trajectory. I think there's a few things there. One is even the language of acceleration suggests that you're just it's only up, right? And just keep going, keep going faster. I think there's more of a need for language of experimentation, right?
Yes.
Of testing, of trying. Um, I would argue that this idea of a zombie startup, right? We have this idea that a zombie is a company that's sort of there only in name. I think it's broader than that, right? I think you'll see, and to your point, if you have the aim of government policy is to create, and if you think about KPIs, a lot of the policies are about, number of new firms created, employees, maybe sort of patent filing, maybe fundraising. There's nothing there that's saying we are focused on boosting really innovative, disruptive startups. We just want more activity, like a quality, not a quantity. And so you end up having zombies in the sense that you have, founders and small founding teams who are going from maybe one accelerator or incubator to another. And I've seen this a fair bit in interviewing startups, that they'll say, well, I've done 2 accelerators before. It's like, well, wait, how many times do you need to be accelerated on? And again, if you go back to that, well, what's the best sort of societal organization or use of resources? Is that it? Or actually, what if you take that sort of speed or radical nature of innovation seriously, it shouldn't be that you stick with a startup that's sort of getting by. You should dissolve and start again, or maybe even go work for a big firm that's that well resourced and able to affect scale.
You can waste a lot of taxpayer money keeping that merry-go-round going, where you say, look at all the startups, look at all the employees they have, but they're not actually making any money, right? They're just eating through the funding, both taxpayer and potentially some other financial investor coming in, and that's destruction of value. That doesn't actually add to welfare and general well-being for an economy.
Yes, but there's a few maybe silver linings to that. One, I think at least now in the UK, the conversation is about this sort of the scale up issue or problem, which I think is in some ways problematic, but in some ways promising, because it's not that we want more startups. It should be, they're absolutely right. We want scale up. We want companies to become big and succeed. That's the whole point, not just having more businesses. So I think there's something there. Actually, I'll just say that. I think that that's a sort of a promising direction, that it's not just more activity. Oh no, but I was going to say also that actually working in a startup in and of itself can be useful for the human capital, right? And the social capital that comes with it. If the idea is it's more about experimentation, let's have startup activity, but then not have this perverse desire to have it just continue to sort of muddle along. I mean, as you mentioned, in a VC portfolio, 1 out of 10 will succeed, and you need that one to be your fund returner. But the other thing I would say is that if you think about, again, the social purpose of supporting startups, if it's not really about startups as the target beneficiary, if it's really about big business, then those startups that are complementing or helping sustain the incumbents makes sense from a government policy perspective.
Because I guess the example would be a startup that doesn't go to IPO and kind of eats through a lot of capital, but let's say they have some IP or some kind of knowledge that they might not have been able to commercialize it, but then the founders then go work for a big company and they take their knowledge and experience with them to the big company, who then is able to commercialize it through scale and so on and so forth. So it has a way of doing, but you still need to have a bigger economic ecosystem to do that. You need to have the big companies. You need to have, and I think that's why Silicon Valley works, is because you've got lots of experimentation. You have lots of more and more big companies, but you have smaller ones. You have startups, which all of this allows for price discovery. And I think this is where governments fail, in that, especially in developing countries, and I've said this in kind of some advisory work I've done around strategic investment funds, is you say, well, wait a minute. If you're going to set up to facilitate venture capital or to invest in strategic companies, how do you know you're paying the right price if there's no other person competing for that investment? I mean, if we go to Silicon Valley, startups, they have options. They can go to really big investors. They can go to the startup VC, the smaller VC funds that have just started. And there's all these people coming together, and that allows for price discovery. Whereas if you're the only game in town, then how do you know you're not paying, 10 times more than what the market would pay?
And you're fueling this bubble that doesn't contribute to dynamism, because it's just more startups that aren't necessarily going anywhere. I mean, I think the Yozma example in Israel, which, just to say, is it's been an attempted sort of model to be replicated in different markets that often don't work as well. And there's a crucial reason why. But the Yozma Fund worked well because one of the core stipulations was that the GP, the general partner of the fund, had to raise a matching amount of money from private limited partners, from private investors. And so that market imperative was there from the beginning. As the Yozma Fund sort of diffused, if you will, around the world, there's this sort of incentive for governments to say, let's just add a few more requirements onto that. It has to be companies that are, from this particular market at this stage, or let's soften that private investor requirement. And I think actually one of the great things about Yozma as well is that it was institutional investors who were co-investing or investing in the Israeli VCs from around the world, right? So it had this linking in, whereas sometimes you get that sort of nationalist, we want to have our national, local investors investing in our VCs, investing in our startups, and the whole ecosystem is then so locally contained that you don't have the nice sort of mechanisms for going public or raising capital later, the scale up problem.
And if everyone's friends, if you like, and everyone is kind of, you're not going to ask that person for more money, or it's, I don't want to say it's corruption in the sense, but this is the problem with closed environments, right? Is that you don't have an external force coming in, or external person looking and doing due diligence and saying, well, I'm not going to put my money on that because it's not a good deal. It's not a viable business. Whereas if you're in a closed environment, it's like, well, we kind of need you to say yes to this because, this guy's friends with this guy, and that stuff happens, right? Let's just say what it is. And that's not, you don't get innovation that way. It's it becomes crony capitalism, if you like.
And also some of these lenses of, if the state is driving the investment and they want to see, certain themes really supported, that also, it distorts where real return might be, right? And so, yes, you can sort of say, if you're reporting sort of process outcomes and look at the money that we've allocated, but if you don't see the big exits, the big returns, and as you mentioned, I think we were talking earlier, right? The sort of the lack of exits, the IPO window is closed, then that market mechanism is again subverted. I mean, again, Yozma, which in my first book was like, this is the model that diffused. But again, one of the clever things about how it was structured, which is something that many governments get wrong, is that from the beginning, the paperwork said, we have 5 years. In 5 years, this will not exist. It will be privatized. It can stand on its own. It will make money, but it will not be an evergreen fund where the government continues to invest year over year. And you see that a lot. I mean, frankly, you see that a lot in Europe in particular.
Yes. So I want to talk about innovation ecosystems and those models. And you've mentioned the Israeli model, but let's just go straight into what's happening now. I mean, you just mentioned Europe, which my observation, and it has been for a long time, that the response to we need to catch up with American innovation or Chinese innovation is more state, more state, more state, or in the case of Europe, more European Union funding of some sort, more let's all get around the table. It's always a government response. And the UK, even though it tends to have a bit more liberal tendencies, liberal in the classical sense, market liberal, still very statist in many ways. I mean, they recently created the National Wealth Fund, which is still peanuts in terms of size. Scotland has its own investment fund. So there's always that sense of the state needs to do that. I'm very skeptical that this is going to lead anywhere except for wasting European and UK taxpayer dollars. And I'm not a card-carrying libertarian, even if though I sound like one right now. But what does Europe and the UK, let's say, get wrong? Or what in your view, compared to, let's say, Israel or the US or across East Asia, where we do see more innovation happening, we do see thriving kind of venture capital markets and companies that are able to raise money. What are they getting right? Because, there's a reason why companies in Europe, startups and founders, both and in the UK, are so quick to go to America. Why is that?
First of all, I mean, that's the scale up problem, right? Is that it's not that there aren't great entrepreneurs in the UK or in Europe. It's that they start up, they raise some money, and then as they're starting to get success, they move headquarters and they raise the bigger money and they move to the US, right? I think and the focus, at least in the UK now, the rhetoric is increasingly we need to support scale ups. I think one of the concerns that I have around that, even though I think directionally it's the right thing, one of the concerns is, well, are you going to try to sort of stop, the market from going global? I don't think that's the right thing. I mean, the adage or the saying that the US innovates, China imitates, and the EU regulates, right?
Yes.
I mean, so a lot of my work is on East Asia, and so maybe I'll start there from the positive. I mean, thinking about in Japan and Korea, for example, the approach has been what I call sort of contextual rationality, right? It's not just copy in Silicon Valley, which I think happens maybe closer to where we live.
Yeah.
The in different ways in Japan and Korea, the point of startups has been pretty clear that it's to complement existing competitiveness in terms of industries. It's to be funded by and work in partnership with big business, right? I mean, looking at the biggest investors as venture capitalists in Japan, for example, it's the Keiretsu, it's Mitsubishi Financial Group, it's the Sumitomo Mitsui. It's the sort of the same usual suspects that it the economic miracle. And so it fits, it makes sense. And the ecosystem works in that way. It didn't just try to copycat pieces from elsewhere.
Okay, so but that's still on the scale up issue. What has always struck me is that yes, capital markets in the US are much deeper than they are in Europe. That's for sure. But the UK is a very rich country. Europe has very many, rich countries. Take the Netherlands, for example. Dutch pension funds are some of the largest in the world, and there's Dutch pension fund assets of 100, I don't know the exact figures now, but 150% of GDP. I mean, it's huge. UK, we also have very large, we're members of USS as academics. One of the largest pension funds, I think, if not the largest pension fund in the UK. I'm still, because of my previous work experience, a member of the Dutch Civil Servants and Educators Pension Fund, ABP, which is one of the largest in the world. So it's not like there's a dearth of capital to scale up businesses. And there's also a lot of state capital. But I'm still wondering, I guess, to put this into a question is that what is stopping the scale up problem now, and does it need a government response to it? Like I feel like there's still something missing other than, well, we're going to America because we can raise more money and the IPO is bigger. I still find like there's something else that is pushing innovation or innovators and entrepreneurs away from Europe and the UK.
So starting with the investors, even though there's big pension funds and deep pools of investors, I mean, so for example, in the US, you have the ERISA reinterpretation of the prudent man rule in the 1970s, which meant that CalPERS and big state pension funds could invest early and then they saw returns. And then you have this, virtuous cycle. Hasn't happened in the same way, certainly in the UK. And I just recently read about that with Juanita, right? There's still sort of dampeners on the ability for British pension funds to invest in venture.
Right. Or if they are investing in venture, they're investing in intermediaries in the US.
Yes, it has been. I mean, there was the Mansion House sort of compact, right? This idea of we're going to force the market to invest a certain allocation to venture, to which I want to say, no, please don't. That sounds like a terrible idea, because the pension funds need to also develop the capacity to be good limited partners, spot talented VCs and not just those that are, saying the right thing and they have the right mission and everything. So I think that's one thing. I think regulation and that thing about the EU regulates, I think there's different frictions on your ability as a founder, as a startup to grow, right? And it can be really mundane things like the global data protection rights. It can be just frictions on your ability to acquire markets. And if you're a founder looking at growing a global business, and if you're in the digital sort of era in some way, which most big, scale ups and unicorns are, you want a global market. And so you don't sort of need to be focused on a specific market and, align with or hit all of the requirements of the regulations there. So the sort of bureaucracy around running a business, I do think is a dampener. So I think the combination of, also the sort of risk, the genuine risk capital of the, say, big investors, the institutional investors. And just to say, I mean, I worked in the hedge fund world here in the UK. And so I'm very aware of what different allocations in a portfolio are supposed to do. But it has to be that with venture, as you said, it's lumpy. Yeah. Right? There's going to be some fantastic performers and there's going to be complete duds and write-offs. And that risk tolerance needs to be there so that you have the capital that's there, not only in the very early stage. I think, for example, the UK is pretty good at early stage, maybe even round A or B. But as you see companies really scale up and do well, the risk capital isn't there in the same way as you have elsewhere.
But that's where governments want to keep, right? They want to create the unicorns, but they're desperate to keep them home. But they can't, and there's not really a mechanism to do that. And I wonder do you think in your interactions with VCs and founders in the course of your research, are they exiting? And I know you've done East Asia more, but being in the UK, being in London, you may have had conversations, but are they leaving because there's more state involvement in VC and innovation generally, in the sense that they're just there's that sense of the state's there and it shouldn't be. And I'm not saying just as a sense of regulation, right? There's regulation in the US and there's regulation in East Asia. But in the UK or the European context, is it that sense of just worry that the government's just a bit too interested again, now I sound like a libertarian and want to get the state out of the way, but I'm just trying to find this kind of the cultural element of it where are founders leaving because they want this sort of footloose capitalism, anything goes. America is, sure, you want to try something, whereas there's that cultural element of not so sure, maybe this, let's not do that.
So according to at least the latest data that I saw from Bowhurst, UK top performing startups, or on the verge of scale ups, I guess, 39% are immigrant founders, right? So they're not all sort of British and culturally British in that way, whatever that means, because I don't, I'm dual national, but I still sound very American. Whereas the UK population is something like only 15% of who lives here are sort of British born.
But
So I
those
think,
figures are similar in the US as well. A lot of companies and startups are also immigrant founders, but, and that's across the board. It's, immigrants just are founders, right? And
yes, I'd love to just quickly on that. I mean, I've done a lot of research on who are the top performing startup founders in ecosystems, because I'm fascinated by this question of who succeeds, right? Like who, if you can look at someone's sort of background and experience, what is it about, if you think about their sort of like types of capital, right? Like their human capital, like where have they studied? What have they studied? Right? Are they engineers? Have they gone to Stanford? Are they immigrants, or are they returnees that they've lived elsewhere? What's their social network like? And you're absolutely right that in the US, immigrant founders also play an outsized role. And I think in both cases, in looking at the UK as a springboard, which if someone asked me, which they haven't, but instead of framing what's happening in the UK now as a scale up problem, I would sort of embrace the fact that we have a springboard uniqueness, right? Where talent comes from around the world, often to UK universities, and start up. And that has a very positive impact on actually innovation, potential, creativity, et cetera, in the UK. And then those same founders who, let's say, have come from around the world are, yes, they've come for opportunity, and they continue to look for that big opportunity. So I think trying to sort of somehow contain wouldn't be the right thing. I mean, just to say, in different markets, there's a different sort of return to that returnee or transnational experience. So just to say, because I love this line of research. So we, co-authors and friends of mine, we looked at, are the founders of China's unicorn companies, are they like Jack Ma in the sense that they're sort of like made in China, we call it, right? Like they've studied and worked locally and maybe even in their local province, or in the early 2000s, a lot of research showed that they were returnees, often from the US. And what we found is that this current cohort of unicorn founders in China are mostly actually ground beetles, like made in China, and they're benefiting from their local connections and local know-how.
the new innovators are local now.
Yes.
But that's
And
part of this. China's created, there's deeper capital markets, there's more dynamism happening. And so there's no reason to go and learn from living in Silicon Valley. You can get everything you need at home.
exactly. And the pace of innovation and the intensity of the competition in China is just fantastically different from the European context, right?
So on that dynamism, again, I think, are unicorns and founders leaving Britain and Europe because there's just they're not dynamic economies? They feel a bit slow. Whereas if you go and live in Silicon Valley, it's like, well, everybody's drinking Kool-Aid, and everyone's got a startup, everyone's got an idea. Half of them are, bogus, right? But there's still that sense of we're on the edge of something, we're doing something here. Whereas I think that's the secret sauce that's really hard to recreate.
Yeah, exactly right. And there's all sorts of sort of animal idioms or adages, right? That it's better to be the head of the chicken and the tail of the lion or something like that, or the tail of the, I think, cattle. Yeah, exactly. I mean, the culture and what's prized matters, but that can change as well, right? If you have role models and if you have successful exits, that that drives or stirs this sort of cultural embrace or promotion. I mean, one of the things is, looking at where, so for example, we've done a similar study in Vietnam, and there we find that it's the current cohort of high performing entrepreneurs are in large part returnees from the US. Right? And they drank that sort of Kool-Aid, have come back, but then have those global connections and have that instinct, but also the capabilities to grow these sort of
Right.
digital companies that are going to hit global markets.
And we see even within the United States, I mean, Silicon Valley is not what it was 20 years ago. There's more and more companies that are going to Austin, Texas, big companies that are moving to Austin and other parts of the South and other parts of the country. And so it's, I mean, Silicon Valley is still very innovative. California is still, despite what people say, still very powerful, and technologically advanced, driver of the American economy. But you do see that shifting to different parts of the country, and partly for cultural reasons and the like.
Yeah, I mean, just to say on that, I actually am working on a piece at the moment that Silicon Valley has also become, not, I'm not going to call Silicon Valley pedestrian, but like that intensity in some ways is not what it was, right? Like there's like yoga classes and it's a lot about like the, nice lifestyle. And in China, for example, there was the phrase, right? It was 996, right? That the working hours in Chinese tech were from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week. But that's not it anymore, right? Now it's 007, right? You work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Instant noodles, which isn't to say that's necessarily a great thing socially and morally imperatives and everything. But in many ways, that's what Silicon Valley like stylized work ethic was like
Yeah.
before, right?
And there's no way that the UK or Europe will ever, maybe, adopt that kind of work ethic and and I'm not promoting this, just to put that out there, that I don't think working 24 hours a day or even the 996 is healthy for a good society. But when you want to compete, you can't unless, I mean, if the Chinese are working 007, how are you going to compete?
And also, the second that a product is launched, the competition to reverse engineer it begins, right? I mean, I love the Kai-Fu Lee idea of the gladiatorial entrepreneur in China, right? That it's just like a death match, that a product comes out, something goes live, and that's it. And you've seen it recently with DeepSeek, and now Alibaba launched, trying to compete in Manus, and it's just the pace and the intensity of constant competition makes everyone better. That's the way. And so, to your point, having a nice, work-life balance and a society that values, a lot of what you and I have chosen to live in Europe, right? I mean, I'm not going to be a total hypocrite on that, but it's difficult to have both.
No, and I think it's on that point about China and DeepSeek, people underestimate the level of competition within China, right? So we see in Europe the response to, let's say, the failure of Northvolt up in northern Sweden. Well, we just need more state capitalism. We need more state-driven industrial policies and industrial strategy. And you think, to be fair, yes, there's a lot of state support in China. There's a lot of state guidance in various forms. The Chinese Communist Party has its fingers in everything, and untangling how China, the Chinese state does things is complicated. And so yes, there is state support, but even with that support, or take away that support, there's still a level of competition that is massively hyper-capitalist. It's cutthroat. We think of BYD and electric cars as being this, but I read the other day there's something like there was 500 electric car manufacturers in China, 500. A lot of them gone bankrupt, right? So there's a level of competition that is, you can't attribute it to just state capital and state capital support, right? And I think that's the mistake that they're making here in Europe and the UK and many other governments is that, oh, we just need to be more Chinese and have more state capital. And I don't think they understand what's happening.
It's a version of that national champion without taking the full lessons of the so-called East Asian miracle, where I mean the work of say Alice Amsden in the government support of the Chebble, right? But Alice Amsden was also very careful to say that there was competition encouraged amongst the Chebble until one sort of took a clear lead. And this is the point of the gladiatorial entrepreneurs that Kai Fili talks about as well. There's intense competition. And then when you see a Huawei or a SMIC in semiconductors have this leading position, there's resourcing around it. But that level of competition to get there, which is hugely important, is there. And I think that, as you say, part of the sort of copy paste of part of the model is let's just support our own national champion without,
Thinking
that
about
competition.
that the market dynamism, the market aspects that create that innovation and that capability. But that brings me on to my last question that we'll finish on, which probably needs another hour-long conversation. It plays off of Chinese growth and competitive threat, as some see it, is we live in a world that is increasingly protectionist in very many ways. Economic nationalism or outright neo-mercantilism is the name of the game. The US is, in my view, becoming more state capitalist. And by state capitalist, I don't mean, necessarily owning the mode of production, the modes of production, but trying to shape markets, trying to corral big business and entrepreneurs to do the bidding of the state. Often in the US case, it's partly in reaction to the economic threat of the competitive threat of China. How does this new world that we're living in, this world of geoeconomic competition, how is that shaping venture capital and innovation generally? Not simply so on the bigger picture, but also these ecosystems and these kind of granular, we're going to set up a regional innovation hub in Baden-Württemberg. And, how do you do that in a world that's increasingly geopolitically tense?
First, on the American response to the Chinese sort of threat, and just to say, Made in China 2025, just amazing branding, right? Had such a lightning rod moment, and you wonder like if it had a different name. I think Noah Smith had said this. If it had a less catchy name, would it have mattered as much? Marco Rubio, before his current job, wrote or led when he was the head of the U.S. Small Business Committee, Small Enterprise Committee, said that they had a report, the American response to Made in China 2025 and the case for U.S. industrial policy. So absolutely, and now industrial policy and the case for it is something that governments are owning around the world. I've argued in my work that they never stopped, actually.
Yes.
And that actually the U.S. has always been more interventionist than it's admitted.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And just to interject, I mean, we know this as kind of political economists because we've never bought into the sort of separation of the state and market. But it's always just struck me that how easy it is for those that are not in the field of what we are, sort of assume that, when Americans talk about being, this liberal market, you think there's so much where the U.S. government is very active. If you're a classical liberal or libertarian, you've never been happy. I did a podcast with somebody about 6 months ago, and I made the claim that, China's state capitalist, but so is the United States. And I gave a bunch of examples in military industrial complex. This guy took it out of this podcast. Right? He was goading me to talk about China and this threat of Chinese state capitalism. I said, sorry, there's a lot going on in America. He took it out of that episode. I don't take things out of my podcast, by the way. So you say what you want, Robyn.
So I started my book, actually, The Venture Capital State, with a Polanyi quote, just to say that the the road to the free market was open and has been left open by the hand of the state. Right, this idea that it's not is a fallacy, in particular in the U.S. But on your point about the how geopolitics is shaping venture and startups, I think I would say two sort of main ways. One, you've seen those Silicon Valley sort of royalty, right? So thinking about the Andreessen Horowitz that you mentioned, Sequoia and others, launching explicitly defense tech funds, right? Seeing an opportunity in defense technology as an industry market opportunity. So I think that's quite clear. The other is that if you're a startup or you're a venture capital fund manager, you're a GP, you think now much more about where you're taking money from, right? And so raising money from investors from, hailing from certain countries became more of a thwarted thing. I mean, I know your work on sovereign wealth funds and thinking about the the venture capitalist of our time in some ways, right? Masayoshi-son. Like Masa's vision funds have raised so much money from sovereign wealth funds and the PIF, and that all seems fine and geopolitically not charged. Like so, SoftBank, investing in and along with the Trump administration's AI push and others. But for startups and for VCs who are looking to raise and take money from a Chinese investor, right? And we saw the US state forcing the separation for Sequoia. They can't run the US and Chinese entity together. So I think you see that in really explicit terms now.
Yeah. No, I think I know a former private equity executive, and he said, I used to take money from everyone as long as it was very clear. And I think his fund was 20% Chinese capital. I mean, obviously invested in companies in the West, but he would raise money from just about anyone. Now he's since stepped down from that role and left that firm. So I don't know if he would say that he would do that same again. He may, but you're absolutely right. It's a very different world. And I know in the sovereign wealth fund world, co-investment and collaboration with Chinese sovereign wealth funds, the CIC, is very difficult. And the Chinese would like to engage more and co-invest more, but other sovereign funds are very careful and don't want to sign along with China. And so that's why you see a fracturing of capital markets in that respect, where, to be fair, the Chinese, they just want to do deals. But then at the same time, they often kind of ignore some of the bigger geopolitical issues, and they think, oh, it's a win-win for everyone. And it's like, are you sure? But it's interesting to see that fracturing.
And you see the mechanisms that have been long established. So like CFIUS, right? The Committee on Foreign Investment in the US, you mentioned earlier the military industrial complex. Startups are part of that now too. And CFIUS has been used to block venture capital investments into startups on the basis of national security, right? Private equity acquisitions, etc. So it's striking how the understanding of what's national security and technologies that have platforms that have personal data, not the way that we maybe used to think about, what's within that high politics realm of national security. That's expanded significantly.
Okay, one final question. I said that was my last question, but I'll just ask on if you can finish on what's the future of innovation policy generally? Where are we going? I mean, taking everything we've just discussed and also this increasing, let's say, economic nationalism or neo-mercantilism that's breaking up the global economy. What's the future? I mean, what do listeners, if I have listeners in government or the investment world, what should they take on board from your work in terms of understanding the next say like 5 years or 10 years in innovation policy and in venture capital?
What it should be or what it will be? I'll say maybe a bit of both.
Yeah.
On innovation policy, especially focused on startups and industrial policy more broadly, is increasingly ubiquitous. And I think we're going to see more of that, rightly or wrongly. one of the examples being this clear push that's happening in the UK towards the scale up problem and the policies and the funding that's going to come with that. For me, what it should be is thinking about the so what, right? What are our aims with this? Like, what's the type of innovation that we're actually trying to drive? Do startups drive semiconductor innovation? Maybe not, right? Like in the Japanese case, for example, that Rapidus, it has 6 or 7 big Japanese companies, NTT, Sony, etc., who are coming together to form a startup, right? Like what is it? What's the aim of it, and how are you leveraging your
It's not a startup in your mom's garage, right?
it's a startup in name, and it's part of the thing is that it's a lexicon, right? And it sounds sort of buzzy and it sounds right. I think that and I'm answering it in the negative, but I think what innovation policy should not be is that Silicon Valley copycat wannabe, right? It needs not to be over engineered. What innovation policy should be is creating the opportunity for the market mechanism, right? So, for example, that private investors are going to validate that it has potential because they're going to co-invest with you. I think that's really key. I think innovation policy should be also about embracing the value of business dynamism and embracing that resources should be released if they're not contributing. Experimentation, not only accelerating, embracing risk, as you said before. I mean, in startup land, in the startup world, there have to be failures. That's sort of the whole point. And the other thing, I mean, then the last thing that I'll say, just to come back to the what it should be or what it is that for me, the clarity around who's your innovator, right? Is it startups that are fueling bigger firms, or is it startups that are really disruptive? And I think innovation policy even at the individual policy level needs to be clear on that.
I said that was the last question, but just to follow up, we work for universities, and higher education everywhere is struggling a bit. And I'm just thinking if, my direct line managers and the bosses of the university I work with are listening, what's the role of universities? Right? I mean, there's always been this thing, universities are super important for the ecosystem. Are they anymore? That's the final question.
I think for the UK, oh, I mean, not only the UK, I think attracting talent, and as we said, like that sort of mechanism for bringing entrepreneurial talent and that sort of like, contributing to the culture of innovation and creativity and risk taking. I think universities have a huge role to play there. I think spin outs and universities' ability to create startups in a direct sense and innovation in a direct sense. Um, in the UK, we need to get better at universities not wanting to take such a large equity stake, right? Like in the US, Larry and Sergey they didn't give Stanford a huge chunk, but there's an expectation or understanding that if your students do well, your alumni do well, it's ecosystem and the university wins. And I think there's been some improvements on that here, but I think we could go further in that. But I think that the nature of innovation, I mean, going back to the open innovation idea, has changed. I think you were getting at this, that universities have for some time not necessarily been the innovators, the place where blue sky and basic science happens. A lot of the cutting edge stuff is happening in the big tech, maybe in particular, for example. So I think it's engagement, right? And it's universities working with.
Right. Robyn Klingler-Vidra, thank you for being on The New Enlightenment, and everyone should go out and get your new book, Startup Capitalism, available at all good bookstores and Amazon, and thanks for your time.
Thanks very much, Adam. And just if I can say on that, the book is open access. Digital version is going to be freely available. Thank you,
Even better.
Thank you,
Even better.
Thank you, Cornell. And there's Cornell University Press have been very generous in giving a 30% off code. So if you are interested in getting the paperback, it's FSS 25.
Great. All right. We'll put that in the show notes.
Cool.
All right. Thank you, Robyn.
Thanks very much.
You have been listening to the New Enlightenment podcast from Adam Smith's Panmure House. If you found this interesting, please consider subscribing and sharing. If you would like to learn more about Panmure House, please go to our website, panmurehouse.org. Thanks for listening, and until next time.